All right. Well, welcome everybody to this PyroLife webinar series. It's really great to have you all, and I'm incredibly excited about our lineup of speakers today. If this is your first PyroLife activity, PyroLife is a European Union funded project in which we're training 15 PhD candidates in integrated fire management. We bring the fire knowledge from Southern Europe to Northwestern Europe. We apply our knowledge of water management and other risks that we have in the north. We apply that to fires, and we very much link science and practice and have a strong eye for social diversity as well. Because if you want to do integrated fire management, it's essential to hear all voices, to have a safe working climate, in which everybody feels welcome and is able to express their ideas. And PyroLife, the research of PyroLife is focused on Europe. And with this webinar series, we would like to really extend our reach into the rest of the world. And so we will have monthly webinars. This was actually one of the few things that was originally planned to be online when we submitted the proposal. We're first starting with a set of webinars, monthly webinars on living with fire. And like I said, I'm incredibly excited about our speakers today. And I'd like to give the floor to Kathleen Uitenwouw. And I would also like to thank the Pau Costa Foundation for all the work they did in organizing these webinars. And with that, Kathleen, the floor is yours to introduce our speakers.
Great. Thanks, Catalina, and welcome everyone.
I forgot something. We are starting with 3 Indigenous speakers because we're talking about living with fire. And living with fire starts with Indigenous peoples. And so we don't just have one expert today, we have 3 experts today, and Kathleen will introduce them for you.
Happily. So before we dive in, just a little bit of housekeeping. Remember that during this webinar, everyone's audio and video is automatically turned off. We'll go through each of our panelists' presentations and keep a question and answer session for the last 15 minutes or so. And feel free throughout the session to write your chats in the little box on the bottom right-hand corner. And we're happy to organize and moderate those throughout the session. This will also be recorded and posted on YouTube a bit later. My colleague Isabel Ottolini, another early stage researcher, is going to write a blog entry for this webinar as well. If you are using social media, please try to remember to use the hashtag #PyroLifeWebinars. And again, since this is such an international group of folks, feel free to write your questions in the language you're most comfortable with. And we'll have to answer in English, but hopefully we can handle all the linguistic and cultural diversity that's out there and make this project so great. I forgot to introduce myself. I'm one of the early stage researchers, and I'm focusing on transdisciplinary approaches to adaptive wild and fire management in rural Mediterranean areas, mainly working with the Pau Costa Foundation, also with Wageningen University, and with a critical knowledge exchange happening in Aotearoa, New Zealand, with the Scion Forest Research Institute. So I'm really excited to present our panel today for Indigenous fire management in the past, present, and future. We're so lucky to be joined by Dr. Simon Lambert, who is an associate professor of Indigenous Studies at Saskatchewan University. He's from Aotearoa in New Zealand. He's a geographer with his PhD in economic geography. And he specialized in Maori environmental management until the major earthquake in Christchurch in 2011. And from there, that led him to disaster research, collaborating with Indigenous researchers and community advocates at the UN Disaster Risk Reduction Platform. And he's also part of the Network Environment for Indigenous Health Research National Coordinating Center. Then we're also joined by Dr. Amy Cardinal Christianson, who is a Métis woman from the Treaty 6 and Treaty 8 territories in what we now call Canada. She's a fire research scientist with the Canadian Forest Service, and she focuses on Indigenous fire stewardship, wildland evacuations, and wildfire mitigation. She's also the host of a really great podcast called Good Fire, which explores fire as a tool for ecological health and cultural empowerment for Indigenous people around the world. And finally, we're also so grateful to have Brady Highway with us, a master's student at the University of Saskatchewan as well. And he is a father of 2 children, a Cree translator, and a lifelong steward and student of the land. He's worked with Indigenous communities in their territories for over 25 years. To give you an example of what he's done, he was the youngest park warden in Canada at 18 years old. He's been an initial attack crew leader, a regional duty officer, visitor safety and fire operations coordinator, and attended over 250 prescribed wildland and structural fires. And he's going to talk to us about his program with the Indigenous Leadership Initiative as they're developing a national strategy for Indigenous guardians and resource management. So thank you so much to all of the panelists and for your wealth of experience and what you'll be sharing with us. And as Catalina said, the basis of fire management is Indigenous knowledge by and for Indigenous people, first and foremost. So we really can't wait to learn from you. And with that, I will give the floor to Simon. Take it away. I'll stop sharing.
Kia ora, Kathleen. Thank you very much. And lovely to hear the introduction. Sometimes we forget how far we've come. And so to the 15 PhD candidates, tēnā koutou, greetings to you and to all the people who have put this session together and to all those who are attending. It's always an honour and a privilege to talk about Indigenous issues. So I was born in Aotearoa, New Zealand. My tribes are Tūhoe Ngāti Ruapani on sort of the central North Island towards the east a little bit. And I always joke that there were no scenes from The Lord of the Rings filmed up at our tribal territory. Otherwise, you'll just have thousands of tourists crawling all over your lands and waters, right? But here in the University of Saskatchewan, I want to acknowledge Métis. This is part of their homeland. This is Treaty 6 territory. And I've been hosted here with my family for the last 4 years. So, Tansi, tēnā koutou, greetings. I just wanted to give a quick overview. I'm just going to talk about how Indigenous knowledge is now featured in several multilateral agreements, particularly the UN Sendai framework. Many of you, I hope, are familiar with that. If not, you soon will be. It's a governing document, you know, for this period of disaster risk reduction discourse. There is an acknowledgement of Indigenous knowledges in there. We also need to acknowledge that Indigenous peoples have sovereignty in many, many parts of the world. There are Indigenous peoples in Europe, so I want to acknowledge the Sami up and around the north of several countries. There are connections between Sami and people in the north of Canada and people in the north of Russia, right, and Greenland. There's an Arctic Circle collective, if you like. And many of our peoples have treaty rights, constitutional rights. So I wanted to touch also on Indigenous perspectives of the environment, and then I will hand it over to Dr. Amy Christianson and Brady Highway. So as I was joking before, actually I don't need to be the expert. I just need to know some experts and have them answer my calls, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. So the Sendai framework is the latest iteration of a series of multilateral agreements brokered through the United Nations, of which Canada is a signatory, as is Aotearoa New Zealand, as are probably all the countries that are represented in our participation today. There's two sections there I want to draw attention to, section 24.1 and 36A.5, where we see traditional and Indigenous knowledges and practices as complementing and contributing to disaster risk reduction. And we see our communities, our people, our knowledge holders and leaders having the experience and the knowledge to help manage their lands and territories and their waters and the ecosystems in the communities in a sustainable, respectful manner. So there were several other mentions: the Yokohama Agreement notes Indigenous organizations. The Hiogo framework talks about community engagement. But what we see is a shift with the Sendai framework into a wider acceptance that disasters are inextricably social, that there are social forces, whether it's political planning, poor zoning decisions, rapacious, unsustainable, unproductive resource extraction from our lands and territories. All of this is culminating into a cascading and compounding disaster hazardous landscape, and wildfires are one of many expressions of that. And I just took this screenshot from a news item this morning. So here there's a First Nation in Saskatchewan who is blockading some of their territory because they have had a company enter without consent and seek resources, seek wealth. So there's a lot of mining, and the energy sector here is very powerful, as it is around the world, and there have been some pretty appalling practices, to be honest. Illegal at worst, but unethical in many of their interactions. And people are saying enough. You'll see this in British Columbia. We've seen it in Standing Rock in Dakota. Our communities are at the front line of fighting for the planet's future. I don't want to be too sort of, I'll stick to the data, but certainly our communities have never given up their rights and are now increasingly vocal and active in this space. And many of our peoples have negotiated treaties with the country now called Canada, with the country now called New Zealand, and around the world. And there is very slow progress towards having that enshrined in your 21st century legislation. But again, it's happening. And one thing, one thing I want you to take from my few slides is that the environment that we're seeking to manage is not something external to us. It's a relation, all right? We have an intimate relationship with ecosystems, with species, with these hazards. And the picture I have there, it's a mural in a beautiful little town in central North Island called Taupo, which is on a volcanic plateau, seismically active. There are volcanoes there. The lake itself, Lake Taupo, was formed by probably one of the biggest volcanic eruptions in the history. It was 2,000 years ago now. But we have these complex relationships with our environment. And so just touching on the Christchurch earthquakes, which, as you heard, is how I became interested in this area. In our culture, we have the god Ruomoko, who is the unborn child of Papatuanuku. So Papatuanuku is like the Earth Mother, and Ruomoko is her unborn child. And like any unborn child, they're a little bit naughty. So he twists and turns and kicks and plays up. Okay, and that's what causes the seismic activity, causes the volcanic eruption. So acknowledging the artist there, Johnny at graffitiesmurals.co.nz, if you want any murals painted up, Johnny for hire. But I want you to just note that we don't see the environment, the hazards, the whatever, as something external to our lives and who and what we are. That we have an intimate relationship with our landscapes That includes the hazards. They're always going to be a part of our lives, and we know how to live with them. So at that, I'd like to pass it over to Dr. Christianson, and Amy, just give me the word when you want me to transition to the next slide.
Perfect. I think I'm here. Can you see me? Okay, perfect. We'll just go to the next one here. So, I'm just going to hit on, I think, a few things that Simon talked about first. So, first I just wanted to thank Catalina and the group there for having me, and just to acknowledge my ancestors and, all the knowledge about fire that was created in the territory that I'm living now. And so, yeah, we're going to get into more of a look at fire here. So, for Indigenous knowledge, there are different ways that we could create knowledge. So Western science, which most of us were brought up in schools and our current universities, is one way, but Indigenous knowledge is another. And so it's based on observation and long-term observation from a local relationship with the land. And so it's pretty specific to that land or that territory where you're living in. It can be handed down through generations. And most of the knowledge like that we have about fire has been handed down, orally for, well, we say since time immemorial. So it's before we can remember. It just, continually goes from person to person. And I think the important thing too is that it can change. New knowledge is created all the time. And so that's actually why I've stopped using the term traditional ecological knowledge or, traditional knowledge, because I just find that those are so focused on the past and, that our knowledge isn't relevant to today. Which I obviously totally disagree with. So next slide, please. So for Indigenous fire stewardship, as Simon said, it's the one cool thing is no matter where you go, Indigenous people all have this relational worldview where, we see ourselves as part of the environment around us. And it's really different from kind of that, we call it Western or dominant European view where, humans are separate from nature. And so we use fire to achieve different cultural objectives on our land around us. So sometimes, we'll burn so that we can get new green grass to attract moose to an area so that we can hunt, so that we can have food to feed our families and, hide to make clothing and art and other things. So we, burn for berries lots of the time. We burn sometimes even for fish, which people think is a little bit weird, but, it's really common to help with decreasing, like the smoke goes up in that, and it decreases the temperature of the streams below, which can sometimes aid in fish spawning, and, burning riverbanks to keep waterways open. So what we see as fire as a responsibility. It's something that was given to us by the Creator to help us in our life, and that we have a responsibility for the landscape. And as Simon said, for our relations, to go out there and use fire to basically promote a healthy ecosystem. So, fire as medicine is what we often refer to. It's a way to help the land to basically, I don't know, make things whole or and it's good not only for the landscape, which, lots of times we look at in fire, but it's also good for people to get out on the land, to be part of it, to see what's going on in the world around you, and to be active on the landscape for your physical health as well. And, we see fire as an agent. So for all Indigenous peoples, actually, I haven't met any that don't, they see fire as kind of a living entity, so that, it has a spirit and that it's an animate object. So in most Indigenous languages, it's the word that they have for fire is an animate being. So, just like we would refer to ourselves. It's something that, is there and it can be used to help us in our life. And as Simon said, fire is sovereignty. So we, want to use fire on our traditional territories to kind of reassert our connection to that landscape. And I think, there's a big lack of understanding of cultural burning out there. So, what it is, when it happens, why you do it. And yeah, I think the other thing I just wanted to say was, sometimes with the dominant kind of European worldview, lots of people, go to Europe because they want to see the old buildings and take part in history. But I would say here, like on what some nations call Turtle Island, like we have that history too, but the relation was more of like a leave no trace, where it was to live kind of sustainably and integrated with the environment. Next slide. So like I said, Indigenous peoples across Canada used to use fire to clean the land. So people had different reasons for burning. Even neighboring nations burned for different reasons depending on their cultural objectives. And so in most nations, there were Indigenous fire keepers. So in some, it was a traditional role in the community. In others, it was, just a general job that most people had and shared knowledge about. And, that expertise was amazing. They knew, times to burn, they would look at weather or ecological conditions around them. They knew different types of burning techniques to use. How long to leave fire kind of on the landscape so that it would burn the berry bush, but not burn the roots so that the plant would come back. And the knowledge was shared through stories and through practice. It was a family activity. So people would all get out on the landscape together. Children had a role in fires, and the fires were so low risk. In that last picture I showed, that was me burning at 6 months pregnant. Something that you would never hear in normal fire conditions for a pregnant person to be out on a prescribed burn. But for us, it's just such a low risk. You can control your smoke exposure. You don't really need PPE because when you're doing the burn is just at such a low risk time. So, we talk about this dichotomy between these good fires and bad fires. And I don't know if you're on Twitter, but we had a really interesting discussion about bad fire. Like, are there bad fires? And I think from an Indigenous perspective, like, yes, there are bad fires, fires that come through and burn so hot and so quickly that they destroy the environment around us so that we can't live in that area anymore. And so the picture here is a picture from southern Alberta in 1903 of some Indigenous people basically demonstrating how they start a prairie fire. And especially in the South, in the prairies, my family were buffalo hunters, and they used fire actively to hunt. Next slide. So as most of you probably know, in Canada and in many countries, when colonization happened, burning was outlawed and it was replaced with a centralized system. And the initial idea in Canada was that that system would protect watershed and timber values by, by eliminating fires from the landscape. But as Simon was saying, like, we know as Indigenous people that's not possible. There will always be fire. There will always be, other hazards out there, and it's just how we live with them. But the first, known record of fire suppression in Canada was in 1610 in Newfoundland, where it was declared that no person shall set fire in the woods. And so the people in Canada were jailed, they were fined. There is rumors, that people I know in California, people were killed over their burning practices that they did. And so it became a risky activity in the north in Canada, where it's much more remote and settlers didn't want to go up there. They still burned and still do burn to today. But they were never at the scale that they had been before. So when Europeans first came here, they saw this cleared out landscape and they thought, oh, this is like, look at these beautiful park-like pristine forests. But what they didn't know was that was our garden. Like that was actively managed to look that way in most areas. And so Faisal Mullah was telling me about, this new idea in ecology about cultural severance. And so, when all of a sudden a community is told that they can't practice their cultural activities anymore, and what that means for people to be told, that they can't continue to burn anymore. And it has huge implications. I've been with elders, you know, who cry when they talk about not being able to burn and to fulfill that role on the landscape. Next slide. So this is just an example I wanted to throw in of one of the, so this was from Northern Alberta, one of the fire suppression, you know, campaigns that they had. So prairie and forest fire laws for this country. And it was 19, I think that says 8 there. It's tiny on my screen. I can't really see, but they had translated it into Cree syllabics on the left and, you know, posted it throughout the Cree territory so that people could see, you know, that they, first of all, couldn't burn, and that if there were fires, they had to go and fight those fires or risk imprisonment. Next slide. So, you know what, I think maybe some of you might have seen me speak before on this, and I didn't really want to get into what I usually talk about is the reasons for burning and other things, but there's been some really neat like physical science studies that have come out. And I was saying to Simon and Brady, you know, that they prove that we were right, like that Indigenous people knew about fire and what to do. And so I thought that I'd highlight some of this work by some of my colleagues. So Mark Parisian and his team that are at the Canadian Forest Service and some universities, they just did a study looking at basically looking around communities at what the wildfire risk is. And, you know, as they say, like there's been decades of active, aggressive fire suppression in the boreal forest in Canada. And so it's reduced the recently burned forest areas near human communities. And has that therefore increased the risk of wildfire? And I mean, you can read all that. I'm not going to get into detail into it, but, and the link is there too for the NEIHR article, but it just shows that suppression policies have actually increased flammability and risk to our communities. And I mean, especially to our northern communities where we have, you know, fly-in only access. So when people are evacuated from these large wildfires, it's fly in, they're evacuated for a month to 2 months at a time. The impacts can be incredibly devastating. Next slide. And so I also wanted to highlight the Mountain Legacy Project and another of my colleagues, Chris Stockdale, his work, the link is on the bottom there too. But so the Mountain Legacy Project is really neat because what they did was basically in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, so actually about half an hour from where I live in Rocky Mountain House, Alberta, they went and there was historical pictures taken by the Canadian Geologic Survey. And so what they've done is gone to those exact places and retaken the pictures. And so, you know, it was kind of just to show landscape through time, but what it's really shown is an increasing fire risk. So Chris and his did some basically oblique photography comparisons, looking at different pictures. I think the earliest ones in that in the Mountain Legacy Project are from the 1800s. And so what they found in their study, looking at all these photos, I mean, there's thousands of them. If you go to the Mountain Legacy Project website, it's really neat because there's sliders, so you can like slide them on the pictures to see the change. And so anyways, they found that, you know, coniferous forest, deciduous forest, and mixed wood forests have increased 35%, 45%, and 80% over the last pretty much 100 years. And that grasslands and open canopy woodlands, which is what Indigenous people burned for to put that mosaic on the landscape, have declined by 25 and 39% respectively. And that, you know, 28% of more of the landscape is in a more advanced successional state compared to the early 20th century. And so what that means for fire is there's a way bigger risk of, you know, bigger, more devastating crown fires. And I just wanted to point out, like in Canada, when we get these massive big fires, it can take 150 or 200 years to regrow trees because we just have such a slow growing season up here with our winters. So it's not, you know, like, you know, in the next 5 years, you know, you'll get those trees back. It can be really devastating. Next slide. So, you know, I just wanted to put out, you know, there's one thing that I always struggle with in fire, and it's who is the expert. You know, we think lots of times that Western fire management agencies are the experts, or, you know, people like me at you know, with PhDs, but there are experts, you know, in fire everywhere, from people who live and have that experience on the land. So Most of you probably know about a drip torch for burning. And so some of the work that I've done with Shack and Indian Band, they talk there about making, 200 years ago, making their own, what we now call drip torch, but that was how they did their burning, using pitch from some of the trees and, dragging it along the grass to light fire. And, what the elder says there is that the Western fire agencies came and saw them doing it and then just adapted it to their, what we currently see now is the drip torch. Next slide, or I think that might be my last one. Oh, I just quickly wanted to highlight the Blazing the Trail booklet. Brady and I were both on the writing team for that one. And you can pick it up off the Fire Smart Canada website if you're interested. It just talks about all the different great things going on in Indigenous fire stewardship in Canada. So yeah, I'll pass it on to Brady now, live from Saskatchewan.
Hi, good morning. Good morning, Tanse. Simon, can you see me there?
I see you, Brady.
Oh, right on. Hey, Tanse, ko gido, Mr. Kupidis ni the Nisidiga asun, wapa washchani the nego chipain. My name is Brady Highway. I'm Rocky Cree from northern Saskatchewan, and I'm from the Peter Ballantyne Cree Nation. I just wanted to talk to you a little bit today about how I got involved in some of this Indigenous Guardians work. When I was a young kid, we started, lived on our traditional territories up in northern Saskatchewan at the confluence of the Churchill and the Reindeer River. I was very fortunate to be able to live up there with my granny, my uncles, my aunties, my cousins, my siblings, and we all learned how to, live on the land in a respectful way, so that we weren't impacting that landscape for future generations, and we took that responsibility quite seriously. We still do. This is what really got me into that work. So I was 15 years old. There was a fire that was coming into our camp, and then we had to. We were faced with a choice of either evacuating or staying there to help with the efforts. And so my dad and myself, we joined with the fire crews, and that was my first job experience working wildland fire. And over the years, as other kids were going to high school, I went up north, and this is sort of what I did for a living. I was very lucky to be able to find this career with some of the traditional skills that I had gained as a young person. I was able to, apply those skills in a sort of a modern contemporary context in protected areas management. Some of the things that I was saying really fit well with the mandate of Parks Canada Agency, for example. And so I was able to move around and do some really neat things with my career, and worked for one of the provincial agencies, and through, the government of Saskatchewan, I was able to, get more involved in some of the sort of high-end, upper level fire management activities, whether it was overhead teams or that sort of thing. I was very lucky to be able to get involved in some of those things. So what the Indigenous Leadership Initiative had asked me to do was to come up with a national strategy for Indigenous Guardians to become involved in wildland fire. Some of my experience lends well to some of the, if we were going to be able to hit the reset button on fire management at an agency level, this is the opportunity that I'm really looking forward to, because like Amy was saying, that there's a responsibility and accountability that we have to the land, and it's important that we take some of those practices that were instrumental in maintaining our biodiversity across the landscapes, to bring those practices back into the current context. So I just wanted to provide that bit of a short introduction. And next slide, please. So this pilot project that I'm working on right now, it's divided into 3 components, and what we're trying to do there is our national strategy is to really divide these into into themes. So before, during, and after the fire, it would be pretty simple for us to start a contract firefighting outfit and get involved in the national fire industry that way. But obviously, there's just so many more activities that can happen with a project of this size. So I'm just showing you a picture of some of the work that I did last fall. So you could see the power line easement there. And so the power line, you know, stretching from Thunder Bay to Wawa in Northern Ontario is really, you know, it's a classic fuel break. You can see the separation of fuels so that it doesn't impact the power line. It's just, in a very basic sense, you're going in there with mechanical thinning, and some areas require hand falling. And so what you're just creating a separation between the fuels. And so this type of work can be very labor intensive, but obviously it provides a bit of an economic opportunity for some of our guardians in that, you know, we're looking at community scale fire smart projects and actually organizing our crews so that we can be able to take on some of those contracts and you know, be able to protect our own communities. What we're trying to do, obviously, is develop Indigenous guardians to be able to step into fire management roles, but obviously there's some real opportunities for transferable skills. And so after the fire season, during the fall and winter periods, some of our crews could get out and get involved in some of these projects and still keep their proficiency around the chainsaw and helicopters up to speed. Next slide. During the fire, this is pretty like straightforward stuff. I think anybody who's been involved in wildland fire, you know, the convention is try to catch them small, and there's lots of, you know, times when those fires go larger. The biggest fire I was on was 180,000 square kilometers. It stretched probably about just about a third of the way east and west across the province of Saskatchewan. It was a massive fire, and you know, and so within these incidents, there's hundreds of different jobs that can happen, and a lot of these, unfortunately, a lot of these jobs end up going towards non-Indigenous people, largely because of the way that the training and the training and the tools that are available to First Nation communities just aren't there. There's just there seems to be a bit of a bottleneck when it comes to the wildland fire industry being able to sort of, you know, allow for traditional, you know, users, traditional knowledge as sort of the way that we can interact and thrive within this industry. One of the challenges is like building this capacity, and you've seen it in a number of publications. I'm a new researcher myself, but one thing I always find that is frustrating about academia is, you know, there's really no practical solutions. You know, like it's very obvious that researchers are very good at, you know, finding all the problems and the theoretical ways that we can fix some of these issues, but there's really no sort of practical, you know, steps that people can take towards, you know, breaking through some of the ceiling that we experience. So that's one of the main goals behind the Indigenous Leadership Initiative, is to make sure that we're able to get involved in direct fire action. Next slide, please. Yeah, I just thought I'd throw this picture in there. There's a number, like obviously we're not using, you know, fire sticks anymore. We're using current model, you know, modern day technology and tools. We're using fire science in a way that can protect our communities and get involved in some of these more advanced kind of activities. And so it's really exciting to be able to provide these skills and tools and training to new Indigenous guardians who are coming up and are taking on this responsibility to protect their communities. Next slide, please. Okay, this is really my last slide. I think that you know, as we start to discuss some of the ways that we can get involved in fire management, whether it's sort of before the fire and looking at, you know, fuel treatments and separating fuels and actually developing a cache and that sort of thing. But really what we're aiming for is program level training and development. And one of our pilot projects out in Mealy Mountains in Newfoundland really kind of, yeah, brings it all together for us, because here they're being able to get involved in, you know, the training, the basic training aspects, but they're actually going to be going out into this new national park reserve to look at some of the values at risk, whether they're cabins or trails or infrastructure, and getting involved in some of the forest fuel modeling. It's really exciting to be able to launch past the, you know, the boots on the ground. You know, firefighting in Canada is very, if you can imagine, just a small army of men and women on the ground, and there's really only a couple opportunities for people to climb the ladder. And so for this pilot project in its first year to be able to break into that sort of upper levels of career development positions, I think it's taken on a whole form of its own, and it's like Simon was kind of mentioning before, it's kind of who you know. And for me, I've been able to just start a little snowball, push it down the hill, and I was able to you know, just watch it grow, and it's a really exciting time. So yeah, the picture you could see here that it's just this is from a project that I was working on looking at values at risk. So we'd fly into different cabins, do a quick assessment, and come up with a little plan to deploy value, you know, the sprinkler kits and that sort of thing. And so it's, you know, the work that we're proposing, it's got a lot of interest from federal and provincial territorial governments. So we're just really happy to be able to, you know, initiate this work and potentially situate ourselves so that we can resume leadership in fire stewardship. I think that's it for me, unless there's another slide. Simon, is there? No. Thank you.
Awesome. Kia ora koutou, that was great. And so just last slide, just a quick summary, and then we'll take your questions. But as we've said, we have the right to manage our environments, and we have the knowledges to do so in a sustainable manner. Now, I would be the first to admit that a lot of our, you know, the transmission of our knowledges through the generations has been disrupted, obviously by colonization. Also, you'll see urbanization is separating many of us from the environment in which we do learn. And so preserving, protecting, transmitting that knowledge is a real struggle for our communities. As our elders and knowledge keepers get on and pass on, you know, there is a real risk that we are going to lose a lot. We've already lost a lot. So, you know, you will see projects around the world working in with knowledge keepers, knowledge holders and elders, trying to retain that, particularly the languages, the names of species, their relationships, the interactions. We also see it challenged by global warming, climate change, that the speed of change in some environments, and particularly up to the north of Canada around the Arctic Circle, and also through the Pacific Islands. I know a lot of knowledge keepers go, geez, you know, this is, you know, I don't know what's going on. It's that sort of rapid pace, but certainly they want to work in with other knowledge holders, other knowledge keepers, including scientists. Our elders are curious people. You know, they're always asking questions, they always want to know what's going on. And so collaboration is you know, not necessarily a problem per se. It's how it's taking place. And so we're demanding ethical engagement. We want relationships, but they have to be based on respect. When there are formal research programs, informed consent for participants. And increasingly what communities are demanding is sovereignty over data. So it's not just sovereignty over land and territory, but data that's generated from research, and that private and public organisations hold and have for some time now assumed they have ownership of. Well, we're challenging that. And it's difficult to change, but I think there's certainly quite a bit of traction now as the rights under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is starting to be articulated a little bit more and a little bit wider. Well, that's the last slide, so more than happy to, we'll have some time for questions, and so I'll pass it over to Kathleen. You were going to moderate Q&A? Awesome.
Yeah, happy to do so. And thanks to all three of you for your presentations. It was really wonderful to get to know a little bit more how these concepts and practices work on the ground in your own territories. If you don't mind, it would be great to have all of you have your cameras on, just so we can pretend that we're not speaking into the void of the screens. So there's some great questions flowing in. The first one that popped up was from Laura Ponce. She says, I congratulate the organizers for introducing us to the Panelist, but I'm happy to know that there are more people interested in the cultural knowledge of fire. I'm working on the cultural management of fire with Mayan groups from Chiapas, Mexico, and Guatemala. Thanks for sharing your findings, and I have a question. How are you thinking that this knowledge can be preserved and continue to be transmitted intergenerationally?
That's what we used to call the $64,000 question. I don't even know where that term comes from, but look, and it is a real struggle. Like I said, some expertise is being lost, but I do know that many elders that I have met are aware of how important it is to hold and to transmit and to get that to the next generation. So they have been more willing to have it recorded, to document, to work in and collaborate with ways. So oral history here is a very big area in Canada, and there are certainly a lot of archives growing in oral history and all that. But I know back in New Zealand, there is a real concern because the knowledge was often tribal. You wouldn't share it with another tribe, you know, it would be internal. Now we don't necessarily have the capacity internally anymore. So people are starting to look beyond the traditional tribal boundaries to have knowledge retained, but really problematic. And I don't know if Amy and Brady have anything from their experience on that, but it is difficult.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have issues with this, and also like with appropriation of cultural knowledge. And so I actually have asked Victor Stephenson from Australia about this a bit, because, I'm like, oh, maybe we should like hide things or, from other, outside agencies and stuff. But Victor, his thing is that what we need to retain the knowledge is practice. We need to get people out, get fire on the landscape, use fire constantly. And he thinks that that's the only way that we'll retain the knowledge, that it won't be retained in, community archives or other things, but it's, getting back out on the landscape. And as we know, that sometimes comes with power struggles, with agencies and communities. And how do we get that, people back out burning in the ways that they want to burn? So yeah, it's a struggle, but I mean, that's kind of what we're trying to fight for here in Canada, with lots of the different nations that want to get back to burning, is just being able to get out and do it.
Yeah, the only thing that I would add to that is to really revitalize and strengthen our languages as well too. Through the languages, how you understand the environment and how you interact within it. There's no lying in the Cree language. Like it's just impossible. The way that the language is structured, it's very descriptive. And so, once you start describing the environment, you can start interacting with it, and you know what's appropriate or not, just through some of the root words through the language. And I think that that stewardship of the land is also really integral with, conserving, protecting the language as well too.
Great, thanks so much for sharing. Another question that came in, well, this talk you're giving is to a bunch of PhDs and to a bunch of people in the research community. So Fulka Ludwig is asking, how can Indigenous knowledge and scientific knowledge benefit from one another? And how can they best be used in transforming fire management?
I mean, I wouldn't even dichotomize it, Indigenous Western science. And here's the terrible thing about academia is we're constantly challenging terminology and changing it, and just as the old terminology gets out and suddenly is published, and people are, and so when Amy says that she's moving away from traditional ecological knowledge, just as other people out there go, oh, I've heard of this traditional ecological knowledge that I want to support, we've already moved on to another term. You'll see our own languages, as Brady was saying, the language is key. Our own language terms used for our knowledge. So that sort of is a way to say, well, we're Indigenous and we have knowledge, but what we call it this. So the word mataranga Māori is used in New Zealand for the knowledge that Māori have about all sorts of things. And that is also very adaptive. It will also assimilate, the musket, Christianity, the dairy sector and white flour and sugar. I mean, it's easily able to assimilate external things. It puts it through a cultural filter. So that's the first issue, is that it's not as though Western science is a monolith that, I mean, if you think Western scientists all sit around and agree on anything, you don't know any scientists. So there's this constant dynamic intellectual engagement. And what we're seeing now is in the fire space, people who 20 years ago might have ignored Indigenous knowledges are now sitting back, and as Jamie's presented some of the data, it's like, geez, actually, maybe they did know something about this land they've been on for thousands of years and had cultural burning. So we're seeing an acceptance of science saying, well, yeah, hey, the data is starting to be very, very solid indeed. So I think as we see successes like that, it breaks down that barrier. And I think it's a false barrier in a lot of ways, but I don't want to have too much of an academic and theoretical debate about it, because, as Brady says too, some practical solutions would be very nice.
Yeah, I think from my perspective on the integration, it's something that we hear a lot about. And I mean, we wrote about it in the Blueprint for Wildland Fire Science for Canada, integrating the knowledge systems. But like what I find with my work is that, as I always talk about that power dynamic, is that what I find is when agencies want to come and work with Indigenous communities, oh yeah, let's, integrate our knowledge. What generally happens is that the agencies cherry pick the knowledge that they want that already fits into their existing system of burning. So, for example, burning for grass for moose to come to the territory. Okay, yeah, that's easy. Like that fits within their worldview already. So they'll kind of cherry pick that out and put it into their agency practices justification for what they're doing and take it out of the hands of Indigenous people. But then there's other things, like fire as an agent, or, fire in ceremony or things like that, it's just too out there, airy-fairy for them. So, they just, okay, well, we'll just skip that part and go back to, berries, we'll burn for berries. So I think that's for me, where the difficulty's laying at the moment is just, it's integrating, but cherry picking things that already fit. So, how can we get around that? And for me, it's just, what Brady's doing with the Indigenous Leadership Initiative, where it's programs that are Indigenous led, that where it's Indigenous people making the decisions instead of just informing decision makers, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Brady, did you have anything to add to that?
No, the two of them nailed it. In fact, I could listen to Simon and Amy go on for hours on the subject. The subject matter experts, they certainly, they know some of the dichotomy and myself, like growing up as a half breed, I'm like half white, half Indian. And, for me, like, it was always kind of a struggle to be able to, like, what do we cherry pick here? I mean, like, we're talking about as humans and the way that they interpret take in the knowledge around the world. And I always find that, like, it's strange for me to try to put those into bins. You know, we can work our way past that and get past some of the jargon and some of the, you know, the catchy phrases used in academia, and just kind of get down to some solutions. I think we're past the point of trying to define the problem. We really do need to start tackling some of the more pressing issues facing our northern communities and around the world.
Great, thanks so much.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the questions are just flowing in, and I wish we could hold you for more than an hour. But here's one from Simona, who is another PyroLife colleague. I think this one is more directed towards you, Brady, but let's see. She mentioned, oh, sorry, this is directed towards Amy. You mentioned that with the extent of Indigenous fire knowledge, cultural burns can be very low risk and don't necessarily require PPE. Are there certain factors that are most important for conducting such safe burns? Is either the timing or the fuel condition the most important factor? Wondering if you think safe and prescribed cultural burning is possible in most landscapes, given the right knowledge and timing. So I guess that's the question for everyone, but maybe Amy and Brady can speak to that.
Yeah, so I mean, Brady is more of, you know, the actual fire, you know, he's been on a lot of fires, so you might know more, but from my perspective and the people I work with, it's all about the time to burn and how you burn. And so usually I saw a question too from Andy in there as well that came through about, you know, how do agency and cultural burns differ? And I think that this gets at that as well, because cultural burns are slow, like, and that's why they don't fit with agency burning that well, because, you know, you got, like, what I found with agency folks is they want to go out and burn a massive amount in a prescribed burn in like a day. And, you know, oh, we burnt this many hectares and, you know, but with cultural burns, like, it is slow. Like on my property, you know, to burn a very small area will take a whole entire day, just because you're doing those kind of slow, low intensity fires. And your burn, so in Canada, it's all around snow usually. So, you know, we're burning just when the snow leaves or just before the snow is coming. And so that helps, you know, contain the fire and make it a much more low risk time to burn. I haven't actually heard of any areas where you shouldn't burn if you're doing it in the proper time with the proper knowledge. I don't know of any burn, you know, Indigenous burn, Brady, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that you would go out and conduct like in the middle of the summer on a hot, windy day. It's all about, you know, basically burning just when you can burn. And I think, yeah, I think, Brady, I don't know if you want to add any more to that, but if you miss that little window that you get, like this fall, it snowed early for us. It got warm after again, but the snow basically took away our burning for the fall. So that window was gone. You have to wait until the spring.
Yeah, for sure. It's all about the timing, and, you know, you're looking at fuel moisture, you're looking at the weather, you know, and the topography is another huge contributor to some of the fire behavior you can expect. And so between those three sort of variables, you do want to plan your fires so that they're small. There's, you know, rates of spread are usually generally lower. But Amy's correct in that, like, you know, some of the targets that we've hit for prescribed fires, it could be up to 20, 150 hectares. They could be quite large areas. And so, you know, comparing that to some of the cultural practices that I've heard about, you know, some of the elders, they talk about how they used to burn at night, and they used to, you know, burn when the humidity was higher, and certainly when the wind was lower, and there was more of an intimate thing. And if you remember some of my slides, you know, there we are using, you know, a Terra torch that's on the back of an ATV. We're using high pressure, you know, water cannons, you know, to spread around some of this accelerant. We're using helicopters, and obviously, like, some of these targets are quite massive. And so, yeah, it's different for sure, but I think that there's enough similarities to sort of look at some of the benefits, whether it's a large scale prescribed fire or a small scale kind of cultural burning practices. I think it's, you know, we're coming into a space where the two are starting to synergize, and I think yeah, there's lots of room for collaboration between Western science.
Oh, sorry, Brady. Kathleen, can I just mention one story from an elder that I heard is, you know, I was out there with them, and it's basically was in BC where, you know, they've got really steep mountain slopes, and they were telling me how they would go to burn one mountain slope out, you know, every day for 2 weeks to burn one slope. And I was like, what the heck? Like, why wouldn't you just go burn the slope? And he said to me that the reason is because you need to control the intensity of the burn. So you use the snow line as the snow moves up the mountain. So you burn to the snow line, then you go to where that, you know, your burn ended at the snow line, then burn. So you do it in little steps. Whereas if you just like waited till all the snow was gone, lit a fire at the bottom, it would basically, by the time it gets to the top, it'd be so intense, it would just obliterate, you know, most things. So yeah, it's just really interesting knowledge like that. And, you know, that's just from them being out on the land. And I always say when I talk, like, for us, like for our ancestors, it was a matter of life and death. You know, if you did the wrong type of burn and burned at the wrong time and burned your territory, you would have to move or die, right? Like it was really high consequence at that time.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's high consequence for some of these prescribed fire programs. You know, if one of their prescribed fires takes off and threatens the community, well, I mean, there's, it's kind of do or die in those situations as well, too. Anyway, yeah.
That's for sure. There's definitely a lot to learn, both from practices of Indigenous folks today, and as you were saying, Brady, a lot of ways that, you know, there are synergies possible as long as they are ethical and consented, and, you know, on the terms of the people whose territory they're in. So I'm so sorry we have to cut short, but it's been great talking with all of you. There's a lot of great questions coming in, and maybe we can compile them into a document and even shoot you another email if you have time, which no one does, but if you want to answer a few more.
Sure, no,
I'd really love to hear from you all. So that concludes our first PyroLife webinar, one of the remaining 42. So thank you for opening this cycle with us. It's we really appreciate it. This critical perspective and reflection is fundamental, and it's the base for all of the fire conversations, and we're hoping actions that come forward. And it's been really great to reflect on our own roles and responsibilities as researchers to make sure that Indigenous communities are heard and have ownership in fire management in the future. So next month, we'll be hearing from Cultural Fire Management in Australia from Ari Goring, and the International Savannah Fire Management Initiative from Sam Johnson. And our colleague Isabel Otolini will be moderating that webinar. And please don't be strangers. We're happy to stay in touch and connected in this great consortium of international fire folks. Kathleen, did you have any last words? And everyone else?
I just wanted to thank you, Kathleen, for the excellent moderation, and I wanted to thank so you presented extremely elegantly and connected the dots really well. So I really want to thank you for that. Also, I heard Brady say that he could listen for hours to Amy and Simon speak. I actually was thinking the same thing, but then also about you, Brady. I could listen for hours to you three speak, and I think also with all the questions that came in that we could not answer or could not handle because of time. There's so much more in this conversation, and I really look forward to being in touch. Yeah, it'd be great to stay in touch, and please stay connected with us. We will be connected with you as a PyroLife network. And thanks a lot for kicking off our webinar series with this fantastic discussion.
Thank you.
Oh,
Thanks,
good,
Kathleen.
our pleasure.
Right.